The evening was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the world feel smaller, more intimate. In the heart of the city, a luxurious gala was in full swing, with crystal chandeliers casting golden light over the elegantly dressed guests. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the air as the wealthy and powerful mingled, lost in their own world of extravagance. Among them was a man who stood apart, not because he sought attention, but because his presence commanded it. Alexander Grant, a billionaire whose name carried weight in every corner of the business world. He was known for his sharp mind, ruthless ambition, and a past shrouded in mystery. Tonight, he was here out of obligation rather than enjoyment. These events were just another part of the game, another place to shake hands and close deals. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, his expression unreadable as he sipped his drink, scanning the room with detached interest. Then, out of nowhere, a voice. "Hi, sir. My mother has a ring just like yours." It was soft, but confident, cutting through the noise around him. He turned, surprised to see a young girl standing before him. She couldn't have been older than 10, her eyes bright with innocence, yet filled with something else, something deeper, curiosity. Alexander blinked, momentarily caught off guard. It wasn't often that someone, let alone a child, spoke to him so directly. He glanced down at his hand, where a single ring sat on his finger. An old, simple band, one he never took off. It wasn't flashy or adorned with diamonds like most of the jewelry in this room. It was personal, meaningful. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He looked at the girl again, studying her. She had delicate features, big eyes that seemed to search his face, as if looking for something familiar. "What did you say?" His voice was calm, but there was a slight edge to it. She smiled, as if she hadn't just thrown a grenade into his carefully controlled world. "My mother has a ring just like yours," she repeated. "She never takes it off." Something cold curled in Alexander's stomach. Impossible. The ring he wore wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was unique, one of a kind. It had belonged to someone he once cared about, someone he had lost long ago. It was the only thing he had left of that part of his life. There was no way another ring like it existed. Unless his thoughts were interrupted when a woman rushed forward, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. She looked worried, her eyes darting between Alexander and her daughter. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said hastily. "She didn't mean to bother you." Alexander's gaze shifted to the woman, and in that instant, the air seemed to shift. Recognition. His fingers tightened around his glass, a slow breath leaving his lips. He had spent years convincing himself that ghosts of the past didn't exist. And yet, here she was. The woman in front of him was familiar, painfully so. She had changed, her face a little older, her eyes carrying the weight of time. But there was no mistaking her. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression changed in an instant. Shock, fear, and something else. A flicker of emotion that vanished as quickly as it came. She hesitated, as if debating whether to acknowledge him or pretend she didn't know him at all. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just coincidence. It couldn't be. His eyes dropped to the little girl again. The way she looked at him, the way she spoke with such familiarity. And then it hit him like a thunderclap. His gaze snapped back to Elizabeth, and for the first time in years, his carefully built walls cracked. "Who is she?" His voice was low, intense. He wasn't asking for small talk. He needed the truth. Elizabeth swallowed, gripping her daughter's hand a little tighter. Her lips parted, as if to say something, but no words came out. In that moment, Alexander knew. The answer was standing right in front of him. Elizabeth took a shaky breath, her grip tightening around her daughter's small hand. She looked as if she wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The weight of the past had caught up with her, and Alexander could see it in her eyes. He had spent years burying his emotions, convincing himself that what was lost could never return. But now, standing in front of her, with the little girl between them, reality was forcing him to confront everything he had ignored for so long. The girl tilted her head, looking up at her mother, confused. "Mom?" she asked softly. "What's wrong?" Elizabeth hesitated, her eyes flickering back to Alexander. "Nothing, sweetheart," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. Alexander felt the air in the room change, the noise of the gala fading into the background. The weight of the past was pressing in, demanding answers. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "tell me the truth." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. "Alexander, this isn't the time." "Then when?" His tone sharpened, though he was careful to keep his voice low. "You disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye. And now," his gaze flicked toward the girl, his chest tightening. "Now, you show up with a child who—" He stopped himself, his mind racing too fast to keep up. "Who is she, Elizabeth?" She looked around nervously, as if searching for an escape. The walls of high society were closing in, their whispers ready to devour anything that didn't fit their perfect world. But Alexander didn't care about them. He only cared about the answer that had been kept from him for years. Elizabeth exhaled, slowly, and for the first time since they'd locked eyes, she met his gaze fully. "Her name is Sophia," she said softly. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. A simple name, yet it carried so much weight. His mind connected the pieces, faster than he could process. The familiarity in her face, the way she had looked at him with curiosity instead of fear, the way she had recognized his ring. His fingers trembled slightly as he clenched his jaw. "She's mine, isn't she?" Elizabeth flinched as if the words physically struck her. Sophia looked between them, her innocent face clouded with confusion. "Mom?" she asked again, a little more insistently this time. Elizabeth's silence was louder than any words she could have spoken. Alexander took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "You kept her from me." His voice was low, but the emotion behind it was raw. "I had no choice," Elizabeth whispered, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "No choice," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "You had every choice, Elizabeth. You chose to disappear. You chose to raise her alone." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You chose to let me believe you were gone forever." Tears welled in her eyes. "It wasn't that simple, Alexander." "Then explain it to me." His words came out harsher than he intended, but he couldn't stop himself. He had spent years believing she had walked away, that she had left because she wanted to. And now he was staring at the living proof that his entire world had been rewritten without his knowledge. Elizabeth hesitated, as if she was on the edge of a cliff, debating whether to jump. The pain in her eyes was real, but it wasn't enough. He needed the truth. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of what she was about to say. "I was protecting her." Alexander's jaw tightened. "From what?" Elizabeth glanced around again, then leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "From your family." For a moment, he thought he had misheard her. "My family," she nodded. "You know what they're capable of." He stiffened. The Grants were powerful, ruthless, and unyielding. His father had built an empire with an iron fist, and anyone who stood in his way was crushed beneath it. Alexander had fought his entire life to be different, to carve his own path, but he knew better than anyone that his family didn't forget or forgive. Elizabeth continued, her voice trembling. When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. I knew if your father discovered the truth, he would never allow me to keep her. He would see her as a threat, as leverage. Her eyes darkened. I had to disappear, Alexander. It was the only way to keep her safe. Alexander's head spun. He had spent years resenting her for leaving, for breaking him without a word, and now she was telling him she had done it to protect their child. From his own bloodline, his stomach twisted. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that he would have fought for them. But deep down, a part of him knew the truth. His father would have never allowed a child to exist outside his control. He swallowed hard, his voice quieter now. You should have told me. Elizabeth's face softened with regret. Would you have let me go? He didn't answer, because he knew the truth. He wouldn't have. A long silence stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. Sophia shifted beside her mother, watching them closely. Mom, she asked again, a little unsure this time. Elizabeth forced a smile and stroked her daughter's hair. It's okay, sweetheart. But Alexander could see the truth. Nothing about this was okay. His gaze settled on Sophia. His daughter. The realization still felt surreal. He had missed everything. Her first steps, her first words, the moments that should have been his to cherish. And now she was standing in front of him, a stranger who didn't even know who he was. Anger, regret, and something even deeper swirled inside him. I want to know her, he said suddenly, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. I don't care what it takes, Elizabeth. I lost you once, but I'm not losing her. Elizabeth's face paled. Alexander. No, he cut her off, his voice firm. You had your reasons. I get that, but she deserves the truth. He looked down at Sophia, his chest tightening. I deserve the truth. Elizabeth looked at him, torn between fear and something else. Something softer. But before she could say anything, a sharp voice cut through the air. Well, well, a cold, familiar tone drawled. Alexander's blood ran cold. He turned, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a man he hadn't seen in years. His father, Richard Grant. His presence alone was enough to make the air feel heavier, darker. He wasn't supposed to be here. And yet somehow, he had found them. Elizabeth's grip on Sophia tightened. Her face draining of color, Alexander clenched his jaw, his entire body tensing. He had spent his life trying to escape his father's control. But now, as the older man's gaze landed on Sophia, something dark flickered in his eyes. And Alexander knew. This wasn't over, not even close. The moment Richard Grant stepped forward, the air in the room shifted. His presence carried an invisible force, a quiet menace that had followed Alexander his entire life. The older man's gaze was sharp, calculating, as it flickered between Elizabeth, Sophia, and finally his son. A slow smirk curled on his lips, but there was no warmth in it. Well, Alexander, Richard said smoothly, his voice laced with amusement. I must say, this is quite the surprise. Alexander's body tensed. He knew his father too well. This wasn't a casual meeting. Richard never appeared without a reason. And judging by the glint in his eyes, he already knew everything. Elizabeth instinctively pulled Sophia closer, her posture rigid. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, and it sent a wave of protectiveness surging through Alexander. You need to leave, Alexander said, his voice low and firm. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. Why would I do that? We're family, aren't we? His gaze settled on Sophia, studying her with unsettling interest. And it seems our family has grown. Sophia looked between the adults, her small fingers clutching the fabric of her mother's dress. She didn't understand the weight of what was happening, but she could sense the tension. Elizabeth spoke up, her voice shaking, but determined. Stay away from her. Richard's smirk deepened. Oh, Elizabeth, you always were dramatic, but you can't keep secrets forever. He turned his attention back to Alexander. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That you could just rewrite history and keep me in the dark? Alexander's hands curled into fists. She's not your business. Richard arched a brow. Oh, but she is. She's a Grant. And that means she belongs to this family. His tone darkened, his amusement fading. You know how this works, Alexander. You may have tried to carve your own path, but blood is blood. And what's mine stays mine. Elizabeth inhaled sharply. She is not yours. For the first time, anger flared in Richard's expression. His charm was a mask, one that slipped just enough for the cold, ruthless man underneath to show. You think you can just erase me from the picture. That's not how this works. His gaze snapped back to Alexander. You know what needs to be done. Alexander's mind raced. His father wasn't bluffing. If Richard had gone to the trouble of finding them, it meant he had already put the pieces in motion. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to take control. But this time, Alexander wouldn't let him. No, he said firmly. Richard narrowed his eyes. Excuse me. You heard me. Alexander stepped forward, standing between his father and Elizabeth. This ends here. Richard let out a slow, humorless laugh. And what exactly do you plan to do, son? Fight me. If I have to, Alexander said, his voice steady. You don't control me anymore, and you will never, never control her. Sophia looked up at Alexander, her small face filled with uncertainty. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she recognized the way Alexander stood in front of her, the way his voice carried an unshakable promise. Richard exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. You're making a mistake. No, Alexander said, his voice unwavering. For the first time in my life, I'm doing the right thing. He turned to Elizabeth, his expression softer. Take Sophia and go. I'll handle this. Elizabeth hesitated, but something in his eyes told her to trust him. With one last glance at Richard, she gently took Sophia's hand and guided her away. Richard watched them go, his jaw tightening. You really think this is over? Alexander met his father's gaze without flinching. It is for you. A long silence stretched between them. And then, for the first time, Richard saw something in his son he hadn't noticed before. Strength, defiance, a man who no longer feared him. Richard exhaled, shaking his head. You always were stubborn. Alexander didn't respond. He didn't need to. With a final glance toward where Elizabeth and Sophia had disappeared, Richard straightened his suit and took a step back. Very well, but don't think for a second this is over. Alexander didn't say a word as his father turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. He knew Richard would try again. That was the kind of man he was. But Alexander also knew one thing for certain. This time, he wouldn't let history repeat itself. He had spent too long living under his father's shadow, believing he had no choice but to follow the path carved out for him. But standing here now, he finally understood the truth. He had a family of his own, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. As he stepped outside, his eyes found Elizabeth and Sophia waiting by the exit. Sophia looked up at him, her small face filled with uncertainty. Are you okay? She asked softly. Something inside him shifted. He crouched down, meeting her gaze. "I am now." She studied him for a moment. Then, without hesitation, she reached out and took his hand. Alexander's throat tightened. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.